we have something very important to talk about today, and it's a disturbing article that the New York Times published about ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and their theology of rape, sexual violence, and the enslavement of women for sexual purposes and for recruiting purposes. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is because this group and groups like it will claim that what they are saying and doing has a basis in Islam. And as I'll show, that these groups have little to nothing to do with Islam, and actually their only real claim to being Islamic is that they claim to be Islamic. They're not even extremists. They're simply outside the tradition, and I will back up all of that. But in order to make this point, understand this point, we have to understand how Islamic law functions. And sometimes when people look at Islam, or they read the Quran, or they approach the tradition, they'll do something like open the Quran and find a verse and say, hey, it says right here you can do X, Y, and Z, or it says right here you can do X, Y, and Z. And they take that to be decisive and conclusive. They say, well, it's written in the Quran, therefore it's your law. That's not how Muslims did it. That's not how we ever did it. It has nothing to do with the historical Sunni or Shia tradition, period. A verse in the Quran functions in the Muslim tradition in the same way a quote does in a research paper. It is part of an argument, but it is not conclusive to the argument until you have seen and engaged with and dealt with the entirety of the tradition, which means the Quran, yes, but it also means the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, how he embodied and practiced and taught the religion, right? That's a very important point to make, because people don't get that. And when they don't get that, they begin to take bits and pieces out of the Islamic tradition and say, well, I found it right there and it's Islam. And so they'll say things like, well, and I saw this on Twitter earlier today, well, there's abolitionism in the Quran and in the Islamic tradition, and there's enslavement, so both of these things are part of Islam. Absolute nonsense. If you don't understand Islam, do us all a favor and learn something before you begin to pronounce on Islam. The way in which we understand the Islamic tradition is by reading it together and trying to understand where God and Muhammad want us as people to go. So in this loud and clear, I'm not going to talk as much about the Quran. I'm going to talk about the Prophet Muhammad's life, because his life is lived in a context, and that context obviously includes slavery, because he was born in a society that practiced slavery. But what he did, and if you look across the Muslim tradition, if you look at his life, what he did was try to eliminate slavery by whatever means he could. So he places restrictions around it. He says, for example, that if you have slaves, you have to treat them the same way as you treat your own family, and he makes this a legal obligation. And mind you, this is a tribal society in which how you treat your family is very important and doesn't mean something casual or something easily dismissible. He says that if you have children by slaves, that those children will not only not be slaves, but they must inherit the same as your other children. They must be treated equally as your other children, which is basically trying to destroy the institution of slavery, right, at the root. Slavery in the Islamic tradition, the Prophet also said, is not heritable, right? It doesn't pass on generation by generation. We don't believe that certain people are inherently inferior or certain people are inherently superior. And then, most powerfully of all, he says, and God says over and over again, that one of the best things you can do as a person to have your sins forgiven, to rise in God's eyes, to have a higher station in the next life, is to set slaves free, right? So yes, there's enslavement in the Muslim tradition, as in it's mentioned. Slavery is there, and there's abolition, but the direction of the tradition is incontrovertibly in the direction of abolition, of freedom, of an egalitarian society. Now, of course, sometimes what happens is that teachings are perverted. So after Muhammad dies, unfortunately, Muslims begin to find loopholes in this. So what some Muslim dynasties and governments and regimes begin saying in the medieval period is, well, since Muslims can't be slaves and slavery can't be inherited, then let's go make other people slaves, and every year we'll go out into other parts of the world and take slaves, because we can't produce slaves through heritability. Now, did this happen in Muslim history? Of course it did. Is it acceptable in the Muslim tradition? It's clearly going against the spirit and in some cases the law that Islam teaches, right? That you can't use loopholes in order to affect things that God does not want you to do. So yes, these regimes are saying, oh, well, there were slaves in the Muslim time, in the time of Muhammad, so what's the difference if they're slaves now? The difference is Muhammad was acknowledging where his society was, even as he was encouraging his society to move in a different direction and pushing and incentivizing and warning and punishing them if they did not do that. And now we've come to a point where we don't just have a perversion of the tradition, we have the implosion of the tradition with the rise of groups like ISIS. Now, people say things like ISIS, they're extremists, they're radical jihadists. ISIS are not extremists. Do you know why? Because extremism by definition is doing too much of something that you should be doing. So, for example, Islam teaches that we should be charitable, that we should give of our money and our time and our resources and our knowledge to help people less fortunate than ourselves. But Islam also teaches we have obligations to, for example, our family members. So, let's say I were to have children who are on the verge of entering college, but instead of investing in their education, I gave all of my family's money away to charity. That would be extremism because I would be doing too much of something to the exclusion of my moral obligations towards those who have a higher claim on my resources, on my background, on my wisdom, what have you. Now, that's extremism because you're doing too much of something that you should be doing, right? You can pray too much because if it causes you to, for example, ignore your health or those around you, or it alienates people around you, and you don't need to be doing it, then you're praying too much. It becomes extremism. You can't rape too much. You can't enslave too much. You can't murder too much. Because you can't do these things, period. Right? There's no such thing as murdering too much because you can't murder. There's no room, period, in the Islamic tradition for taking an innocent life. Not multiple innocent lives, one innocent life. You can't do it. You can't rape too many people because you can't rape any people. Islam treats certain obligations as absolutely and wholly sacred, and you cannot even cross these boundaries if your life is at risk, because we don't believe that our lives end when we die and we have to answer before God for what we did. So when people say groups like ISIS are Islamic, I say, hold on. What they have basically done is gone into the Islamic tradition in order to find whatever arguments they can for whatever base desires they have. And to call this Islamic is intellectually dishonest. It's an insult to our faith. It's an insult to our tradition. And it is ultimately inaccurate and not reflective of what these groups want. They will find any justification to do what they want, because for them, Islam is not about becoming a better person, but about licensing war and plunder and enslavement and death and oppression. And in that sense, it is as far away from the Prophet Muhammad as one can possibly be.